Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. Welcome back to Feminine Roadmap Inspires. And today I have a wonderful story for you. I have Kim Cobb. She is a businesswoman. She is the author of a book, Stuck, A Way Out. And she is going to be sharing her story of being an FBI missing person, one of the first children to be on a milk carton. So without further ado, Kim, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. Why don't we just jump right in? Why don't you tell our audience your story? Because it really is amazing. And the journey that you went on as an individual to survive and thrive after this experience.
Sure. I love telling my story. I love getting it out there in order to help other people. It's hard to really start at the beginning, but where the point that I want to start at today is where my parents met and married in their hometown, small town in Texas. My parents married when right after my mother got out of high school, and my dad was a few years older than her. My mother had a normal, she grew up poor, but she had a normal family, parents married, never divorced. My dad did not. My dad's parents divorced in the 50s when he was about 10 years old. So he was raised not by his mother during that time, but by his dad, who traveled a lot with his job and was also an alcoholic and became abusive to my dad when he was much younger. So my father, when he married my mother, was already in a sort of very needy place, and she was kind of his saving grace. They married and had me a couple of years later. I was born in 1970, and we lived right there in a nearby town in Texas. We moved to Oklahoma, and then we moved back when my brother was born about 3 years later, and really stayed in Texas until the mid 1970s, about 1976. My dad never really had a career per se. He bounced around from job to job. He moved my mother and us quite frequently, either due to not paying the bills at a house and getting evicted, or finding a job in another town. He really was kind of the grass is always greener on the other side, and someone's done something to me here that has destroyed my chances, so we have to pick up and leave. It's their fault. It was a very victim-like mentality. In the summer of about 1976, we were living in a fairly decent-sized town here in Texas, and he actually had a business that had been on a cash basis kind of successful for a while. Things were going okay for a year or two, but he had a real aversion to paying taxes, and so his business eventually failed as a result of his opinions that Americans shouldn't have to pay taxes. So the business failed. So the IRS seized all of the assets of his business. And at that point, my parents decided that they really wanted a fresh start somewhere else. And they had some friends that had moved to Wyoming, and they decided to move to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, move the whole family there and start over, start fresh. So we did. And that was what was to be the last in a series of about 30 moves that my dad took my mother on during their 13-year marriage. 30 moves in 13 years. And little did we all know that that was to be the last one. But within about 2 years after we moved to Wyoming, both of them were working, but their marriage really started to crumble, and it had never really been healthy anyway. But my mother just decided that she didn't want to stay in the marriage, and totally understandable. So she said that she was leaving and she was separating from my dad, and it really didn't go well. He was very irrational through the whole process, threatened suicide from the way I understand it. And what he did throughout the process was communicate primarily with me. I was 9 and my brother was 6 at this time. Primarily with me about what was going on between the two of them, things that I really didn't need to know. So it was evident looking back early on that they weren't working together. She was convinced that she was going to stay in Jackson Hole and she was going to make a go of it and support us. We moved out. We moved into subsidized housing in an apartment by ourselves, and my dad moved out. He moved to a separate town. So we started the process of having routine visitation weekends, like separated families do, while they worked through the details of their divorce. Throughout all of this, my dad continued to have conversations with me about what was going on, and he was of the opinion that my brother and I should be able to choose which parent we wanted to live with. And I was close to my dad. He was a loving, kind, playful father, you know, when they were married. And I was really closer to him as a little girl than I was my mother. So it wasn't hard for me when he was asking me to you know, give him an answer, tell him, who do you want to live with? I told him that I wanted to live with him. So little did I know what that entailed, what that meant. And so on a routine visitation weekend, he picked us up from our apartment that our mother had moved us into. We had, my brother and I were sleeping on cots. We had no beds. We were eating off of cardboard boxes in the living room. You know, she just hadn't replenished everything. And he picked us up, like I said, on a routine visitation weekend. They got into a very heated argument that Friday evening. And it was May in Wyoming, and it's still cold there, and snow's still on the ground that time of the year, so everyone still wore their coats. They got finished with their argument, and he went to put us in the car, and she told him, wait a minute, you forgot the kids' coats. And he told her they won't need them. They won't need their coats. And later on in hindsight, she realized that what he was telling her, and he was telling her what he was going to do. So this was on Friday evening. He was supposed to bring us to school on Monday morning. Sunday night around midnight, he woke us up, and he woke me up and he said, Kim, I need to ask you something. Wake up, I need to talk to you. And he said, do you remember whenever I asked you if Mom and I divorced, who did you want to live with? Did you want to live with me or her? And I said, yes. And he said, well, if you want to live with me, we have to go right now, and you might not see your mom again for a while. We had 2 changes of clothes for the weekend, and that was it. And I remember telling him, but I can't go. I have library books that I need to turn back in. I don't want to have any late fees. On my end of the year school program is coming up, and I have a solo. And he said, you can't worry about any of that. If you want to live with me, you have to go right now. Then we have to get in the car and we have to go. So my brother was still kind of groggy, and he fell asleep in the back seat. And we drove away across the mountain passes and out of Jackson Hole that night. And he crossed the state lines with us, and she had custody of us at the time. She had temporary custody during the separation. So the laws were already broken. Their divorce was not final yet, but soon to be. And so basically after he took us, we went to Salt Lake City to try to get on a flight to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where his father lived. And that's where we were running to. We couldn't get a flight in Salt Lake City, so we drove back to Denver and got a flight in Denver to Tulsa, Oklahoma. After we got to Oklahoma, he explained a little more to us that he'd broken the law, that the authorities were going to be looking for him, and because he didn't have custody of us. And he said that he had done what he did because our mother was fighting to get sole custody of us and take us away from him so that he would never be able to see us again. He was telling us that what she had petitioned for in the divorce was no visiting privileges, which did nothing but anger me and anger my brother because we couldn't see a reason for that. So what it did immediately was create allies in us towards him. We were very supportive of what he was doing because we were angry with her based on our perception and the lie and the tale of lies that was spun, web of lies that was spun. So we began. That was a very a very adventurous summer. There was a lot of drama that summer. There were a lot of phone calls. There was hiding inside the house, making sure that we stayed away from authorities. And my grandfather had a lake house outside of town that no one knew about, and that's basically where we stayed and hid all summer long. He took us to get passports. His original plan was to take us out of the country and to take us to Australia. He managed to get passports before our identities were flagged. But my mother did find out at a later date that from the State Department that passports had been issued to us already. My mother, in the beginning, didn't know what to do. Child snatching was just kind of becoming sort of a big problem right in that time. And we were actually taken the day before Eton Pat's, the first little boy on a milk carton, was taken. It was a big high-profile case in Manhattan. And National Missing Children's Day was named after him. And we were taken the day before he was. So he was the first kid on a milk carton. We were the second or third because of the proximity of our abduction to Eton Pat. So we became classified after my mother kind of determined what her resources were and what could be done. She got through and got everything filed with the FBI. We became official FBI missing persons. My dad changed our identities. He dyed our hair. He changed our names. One of the tricks that he used was to go to a courthouse, and back in that day and time, without all the electronic records, this kind of thing was possible. But he would go to a courthouse and find a birth certificate of someone that was near his age but was deceased, and he would get a certified copy of that and then assume that identity, and then my brother and I just assumed that last name. So we spent that whole summer living in campgrounds, living here, living there, and just kind of trying to establish, he was trying to establish what he was going to do in the long term. At some point, my grandfather, who had been abusive to my dad when he was a boy, became his usual drunk self, and he really just abandoned my dad and the whole situation. So my dad thought that he was going to be able to rely on him for support and helping him through this with us. And he didn't wind up having that. So here he was, a dad all on his own with these two kids on the run. And so it was really interesting about, we actually came back to Texas, to North Texas, which was a big chance to take. And he actually met a woman through, that's a very long story, but a series of events. He ran into a woman that he had actually known in his past life when he was younger. And if you can believe this, this woman agreed to marry him and come into this situation knowing what the situation was. So that tells you, what kind of a person she was. And so she became really the strength of the family, I guess you could say. And he had to have some support, and he couldn't live the way that he was planning on living by himself. So she was not a very motherly, caring person. She was very, very hard to warm up to. She was not affectionate. She was supportive of my dad, though, and whatever he wanted to do, and of his sort of exiting society and living on the run like this. So it was just a really crazy, mentally unstable situation. So she became our stepmother, and the four of us then began really living as fugitives and moving all across the country. Sometimes we had homes, sometimes we didn't have homes. We had this big old green Dodge van, and that's what we traveled around in. And a lot of times we just slept in it, slept out of the back of it. or sometimes was left in campgrounds. Sometimes we did have a house, but if we lived in a house, we never had any furniture. We always had food to eat. We always had enough. There was always enough to provide the basic staples. Nothing fancy, but there was always food. So we really just lived that vagabond lifestyle, and we were able to get back into school under assumed identities, and we couldn't transfer our school records from our school in Wyoming because that was one of the primary ways that she could track us, was by following the transfer of school records. So under our first assumed identity, we got back into school, and but she came very close to finding us after we had been gone for about 2 or 3 years. She got a tip, and that we were in a certain town in a certain place. And in the midst of all of this, how she got tips was she was sending out flyers all over the country to radio stations, to television stations. Our pictures were on milk cartons. They were circulating on missing persons posters in post offices and stores, libraries, things like that. And then she was, she had her own campaign, her own kind of grassroots initiative as well. So there was things going out all over the country, and she got a tip that wound up leading to something. And she was able to locate a school that we were at. She missed us by several months. And we've been gone for about 2 months, I think, if I recall correctly. She was able to go and visit the school, talk to our teachers. It had been long enough that they still remembered us, sit in our desks and, look at our work, our schoolwork and things like that. And the interesting thing was that she had actually sent a poster to that school, and the principal just misunderstood what it was. And she asked him, she said, "Why didn't you call?" And he said, "Well, I thought that's why I got the poster, was because you knew that they were here." And so she missed us. But I don't remember how we had the information that she had gotten onto that trail. But what that did was mean that we couldn't use that name again to re-enter school, because she then had a trail that she could follow with a transfer of records. So that particular year, that following year, we had to sit school out. We didn't go to school at all. By then we were in Eastern Tennessee, and we got some grade-specific textbooks, and we were doing homeschool before homeschool was a real thing. So whatever we could to keep ourselves from falling behind, in our education. We always had access to public libraries, and my dad encouraged reading, and I was always an avid reader. So even though it wasn't conventional, when we weren't in school, we still self-educated and became fairly well-educated people. So but all of that moving around really created some deficits in my in my learning, particularly math, which is important later on in the story when I get to talking about my adult life and my career and things. But we lived back and forth across the country a couple of times. We went all the way as far west as the Pacific Northwest of Oregon and coast of Oregon. But there was always this after the point where she found us at the school, she never came close to finding us again. So that was only about 2 years in. But yet we continued to run. We never stayed in one place. And that's key to what happened to me, sort of the unveiling of what was really going on. But throughout all of this, it was constantly blamed on her that we were having to live this way because of your mean mother and what she's doing. If she would stop chasing us, we wouldn't have to move. But she hadn't found us. She hadn't located us in years. We did move one time because I walked into a post office with my stepmother, and our picture was on the bulletin board. So, and back then the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children also used to put out directories in all of the public libraries. So you could walk into any library and pull one of these directories down. They did one every year with pictures of the and stories of the existing missing children all over the country, and our pictures were always in those. But back to what I was saying, we continued to run and continue to move despite the fact that she hadn't located us in quite some time, and it was again a victim-like mentality. We're having to do this because your mother won't stop. If she would just stop, we wouldn't have to do this. And as a young child, I bought into that. But as I started to become a teenager, I really started to question the why, and why he wasn't taking responsibility for whatever situation we found ourselves in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, or Lexington, Kentucky, or North Bend, Oregon. She didn't get us kicked out of that house because the rent wasn't paid, or she didn't get the water turned off because the bill didn't get paid, that kind of thing. So these sort of rational thoughts started playing out in my mind. And as I got, my stepmother was extremely unconventional, and I look a lot like my mother. I've always been told that I look a lot like my mother. My mannerisms are a lot like hers. And so because my dad's hatred had developed so deeply for her, it was just constantly hammered into me that you can't be like your mother. You can't be like your mother. She's all of these ugly names. And so we lived in this very controlled environment because we had a secret. So my brother and I didn't develop friends. We didn't develop social circles. I was always afraid that I was going to mess up and blab something that I shouldn't blab. So I just kind of stayed away from other people in school and people my age. But we had this very controlled environment, and there was no way for me to conform to what they needed me to be, because they were trying to get me to shed any qualities or characteristics that were like my mother's. And that's completely impossible to do because she gave birth to me. So it became an increasingly difficult situation for me because I was swimming upstream and trying to be someone to protect myself in the situation that I was in to survive that. And it got to the point where every single day there was one of three things going to happen. I was going to be criticized about something: my hair, the way I was walking, the way I said something, the way I looked, my tone of voice, my opinion about something. Thought control was a big piece of this. And if it was a good day, I would get praise. And then, a mediocre day, there was nothing. It got to the point where I lived for those days where I was going to get praise because I knew that things were okay for that day. Things were okay for that day. And once I got to be a teenager, we had actually come back to Texas, and we were in South Texas, and we had actually been somewhere, this one place, for about a year and a half, the longest time we had ever lived anywhere. We were in almost all of the states at one time or another. So things had settled down a little bit. My dad was getting a little bit older, and he really liked where we were living and whatnot. But I was getting to be a teenager, and I was really rebelling against the situation, and the level of control that was required because of the secret that our family was harboring was just unbearable to me. I mean, I didn't go out. I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't date. I never had boyfriends. All the traditional things that parents of teenagers have to worry about, they didn't have to worry about any of that with me. It was taken to a completely different level. And our food intake was controlled during that time. My stepmother started controlling particularly my food intake. We came home from school one day, and she had a padlock on the refrigerator door. And so it was an extremely controlling environment. And I started resisting and rebelling and trying to talk about it. And that was not really going anywhere. And it started to really bring everyone's ire and anger up, and that I was not conforming to the situation. And when things got really clear to me when I was about 15. Um, Everybody I was around at school was starting to plan for college, and that I was a sophomore. College, talking about what you want to do, what you want to be, and I was a good student. And I've always been a dream big, kind of ambitious person, and think about things in terms of future possibilities. I'm never really rooted in whatever, bad situation is going on now. If I can see the end of the tunnel, we can fix it. We can get beyond it. I stay focused on the future, and I've always been like that. So it completely destroyed me when he told me that I was not going to be able to go to college. And the reason was because to go to college, I would have to assume my birth identity. And if I assumed my birth identity, then all of my records were flagged, my birth certificate and whatnot. So the FBI would immediately know. And he said, if they find you, they find me. And then he would have to suffer the consequences, pay the consequences for what he had done. And that just wasn't an option. So all of those years of the propaganda being, we're having to live like this, and I'm having to do what I'm doing to protect you from your mother, and from your mother taking you from me, came crashing down in that one instant when I realized that this was not, it was just lies. It wasn't what it was about. He had used abducting us as an excuse to live the life that he wanted to live anyway. And so I realized at 15 years old that he was my dad, and I loved him, and I felt like I owed him a lot, but I didn't owe him or anyone my life. And so I started making my plans to leave and to do something about this. And I didn't really have a good plan. I just knew, I honestly had blinders on, and just kind of, there was a boot in the small of my back, is what I've always said, that was just supernatural force that was pushing me on. And something just kind of snapped, and I knew that I had to do something. And about a year earlier, he had become very kind of lonely and disconnected and missing some of his family. He had a sister that he had used to be very close to. He had actually trusted her with our whereabouts. And during all of these years since he had abducted us, none of our family, none of his family, my mother's family, none of them knew where we were. So he had trusted his sister with our whereabouts, and she had visited us one time, and quickly saw the dysfunction. As an outsider looking in, she quickly saw it, and she did a little communicating with me to let me know that if I ever needed her help, I could let her know. That was really the message. If you ever need my help, let me know. So we did have a telephone. It was one of the only places that we lived that we ever had a telephone, because we were never in one place long enough to need one, or have anyone to call for that matter. So we did have a telephone, but I was extremely scared to use it and to call my aunt, because I knew my stepmother, she controlled everything. And so I didn't want her seeing the bill and knowing that I'd called. So I borrowed my brother's moped, and I drove down these country roads to a little store about 5 miles away, and there was a payphone, and called her collect. And I told her that I was leaving, that things had escalated to the point where it wasn't just miserable, that I was starting to get scared. And I had never been physically scared of my dad before, but it was getting to the point that I was, because he realized that I was not buying it anymore. And so things weren't within his control. And there were a couple of incidences where he had, put his hands on me roughly. And let me clarify that never in all of this was this ever a physically, sexually abusive relationship with my dad. It was, mentally and emotionally not right, and completely dysfunctional and unstable, but it was never physically abusive. So when he did that, when I started kind of pushing the envelope, it really scared me. And so I knew that was one of the things that told me that this is, he would have known if I was faking it. And so I told my aunt that I had to go, and that I was leaving, and I was running away. And she said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I have a friend who has some friends in Austin, Texas, that I think they'll let me stay with them for a while until I can figure out what I'm supposed to do and how I'm supposed to get my birth records and all of that. And I'll have to decide what to do about seeing my mother. And see, I wasn't of the mindset that I was leaving and rushing to my mother, because I still believed the things that he had said, even though I knew that I needed to leave, that this wasn't right. I didn't know the truth yet about my mother and her story and what she had been through. All I had ever heard was one side, and that was his. So I still believed all of that. So people ask me all the time, well, why didn't you just go directly to your mother? Well, as far as I was concerned, that was just as bad. I just didn't know. So I didn't want to do that either. And my aunt asked me to give her a couple of weeks. And then she said, can you stay 2 more weeks? And I said, that's about it. And so she said, call me back. And I called her back in 2 weeks. And she said, I've talked to my husband and we want you to come to Dallas. We want you to come and stay with us, which I was not expecting. So I had to get myself there, and had a friend help me, get a plane ticket. I got on an airplane with a little duffel bag and flew to Dallas. And I got off the airplane at the airport in Dallas, and at a gate where it's ironic. I mean, I got off with ragged clothes and one little bag with just a few changes of clothes in it, and I find myself going in and out of that terminal and that gate quite frequently now on a business trip, and put together and bag and shoes. And so it helps me to remember, that there was a time when I never would have thought that I have the life and I have the things now. And I got off that plane and she was nowhere to be seen. And I was terrified. And I thought she had changed her mind. And of course, this was the days pre 9/11, so you could come to the gate. And I was 16 years old, 2 months away from my 17th birthday. And so I did not know what I was going to do. I had $35 in my pocket and these clothes. And I thought, well, I can't go back. That's not an option. So I will have to figure this out. I just started walking and I had no clue what I was going to do. And I walked around for about 15 minutes and then looked up, and then here she came rushing down the aisle, and she was just running like there was bad traffic and whatnot. And so she took me in, and I had to drop out of high school, obviously. So I didn't go to high school beyond 10th grade and was a dropout. And that wasn't acceptable to be acceptable to me at all. I mean, I wanted to, get a higher education. So started studying for my GED, and we started trying to plan, and I tried to get an idea of how I wanted to emerge and see my mother. Back up for just a minute to the actual day that I got to Dallas, and I actually had to call my dad and tell him where I was. I told him where I was and that I wasn't coming back, and it was the most violent conversation that I have ever had with anyone in my entire life. It was nothing but proof that I had done the right thing. He just went into a crazy animal-like rage, and he told me that I couldn't do this without my mother finding me, and therefore, the authorities would find him. He was terrified of going to prison. And he said if the cops pull up in my driveway, he said none of us are going with them. And basically, he said that he was going to kill all of them, and then he would kill them too. And he said all of that blood would be on my hands. And so I knew I couldn't go back. My aunt feared for my life if I went back. She looked at me and she said, do not be tempted to go back. They will kill you and bury you in the woods, and we will never know what happened. And so I definitely wasn't going back. And so I stayed with my aunt until I turned 18. Studied for the remainder of what I needed to feel comfortable taking my GED test, and got counseling during that time. Just really tried to, it was such a blessing that I was with her, because she had so much family history. She was able to sort of help me start putting the pieces together. And that's really where putting the pieces together started for me, was during that year It was a really long road to get the whole thing in perspective, and it didn't happen that year, but it was where it started. So when I turned 18, we went to the town where my mother lived. She had moved back home, and my dad's mother, my aunt's mother, actually lived there as well. And so I went and stayed with my grandmother, and while my aunt went and found my mother, met her for lunch, and told her that she had me, and that I wanted to see her. And so we were reunited after almost 9 years of separation in a school parking lot in Texas. And it was a really surreal feeling. I mean, she was expecting this really big emotional reunion. I had a huge wall up. I didn't know what to expect. I had no clue at the time what she had been through. At the time, I really wanted to just get this behind me, get it over with, and move on with my life. My goal was to have a normal life for a change. I wanted a normal life. So in my head, I was overcoming what had happened to me by leaving and by coming here, seeing my mother, checking this box, so to speak. And then I was planning on starting college and being a normal person my age and just putting all of that behind me. Not the way to handle it. I had been lived outside of the normal skirts of society for, the majority of my life. I did not have any of the tools to manage relationships and understand how naive I was, how vulnerable I was. I thought that by having the courage to leave my dad and do this and leave the situation and do this, I was, a strong person. I had overcome, and I was off to the races. I was on cloud nine. I mean, I thought I had the world at my feet. What I didn't realize that I just wasn't equipped. I wasn't equipped, and I needed to do a lot of repair work, or work, just the initial work to get myself to the point that I'll emotionally be developed that most 18-year-olds already were. So I got a job, and right away I met a young man and fell madly in love with him. My mother and I were trying to build our relationship. I actually had moved in with her, and all of that just stopped because I became completely obsessed with spending time only with him. And I didn't get to know him well enough. He was a local person who everyone knew, and I was completely infatuated, and it just took complete control of my life, and I stopped doing some of the things that I had been doing. I was in college and doing that, and that had been my goal, my passion. I left home. The straw that broke the camel's back with the situation with my dad was he wasn't going to let me go to college. So now I get what I want, and I start just kind of minimizing it, and it plays a second priority to this young man that I met. So I started not coming home late at night. I didn't. I was 18. I told my mother she couldn't tell me what time I had to be home, and all of that. And we got really cross. She got really bitter. She thought she had me, and then she thought she had me back, and then she was losing me to someone else. And there just was no balance for me. I was one extreme or the other. And so I wound up moving in with him at the age of 18, and we wound up commingling everything. He was very suppressive in his attitude about education. He didn't understand college. He didn't understand why people wanted to go to college. He literally used to tell me that I don't know why you want to go to college anyway. You're just going to wind up pregnant and checking groceries in a grocery store for the rest of your life. And so it was a constant little message, like that. But what I had done was just jump from one controlling relationship with a man to another controlling relationship with a man. I didn't see the paradigm. I didn't see the parallel. And so he it was all nice and rosy at first, but it just continued to deteriorate pretty quickly, not even slowly, but pretty quickly. And I had very strict views on I thought he was my partner for life. I had strict views on sort of just casual sex. I wasn't, I thought premarital sex was not right. And so, but I justified it in my head because, well, I'm going to marry him. He's the one, and whatnot. So that held me back for a long time from leaving him. But I just allowed myself to become defeated. And I wound up walking into the college, and I had a straight 4.0 average. Walking into college one day, decided that I just didn't want to hear him complaining anymore. If it would please him and make him happy with me, then I would quit college. Walked in. Actually, no, I didn't walk in. I just didn't go back one day, so I didn't withdraw, which meant that later on, if you don't withdraw, your 4.0 turns, all your A's turn to F's. So later on in life, when I wanted to go back to college, I had a huge hurdle to get over. So, we just kind of lived, we lived together until I was 24. When I was 21, I went to work for that same college. I went to work in the accounting department. And I had various bookkeeping and accounting jobs up until this point, and I decided I wanted to take a step and do something a little bigger. And what I did was go into the finance department at this college, and became the assistant to the dean of fiscal affairs, which is basically like the CFO for the college. And she became a huge mentor to me. She made it a requirement that I take accounting classes and go back to school. Which was a real pivotal point in my life. But she was a very, very good influence on me. And so I started taking college classes again in secret. And it got to the point, though, where I couldn't do them during the day anymore. Because of my work schedule, I had to do them at night. And that's when things really started turning badly between my boyfriend and I. And he just didn't want to see me pursuing my education and bettering myself. So he broke a dinner plate in my face one night when I got home from class, and he really didn't like the environment that I was in, at the college, with the professional environment, and it made him feel less than. It made him feel like everyone else thought they were better than him, and it wasn't something. I again went back into this mode of trying to fix it and fix him and make him see, what the real truth was. And I had a friend that I worked with who asked me one day, she said, "Do you know what codependency is?" And I said, "No, I don't." And she said,
You're like, "No, I'm living it, but I have no idea what
"I
it
have no
is."
idea." And she said, "Well, I think you might be that." And she said, "There's a really, really great program at my church. I'd love for you to come with me." I didn't go at the time. He and I were still together. But he embarrassed me really bad at a professional work function. And I realized that this was going to be an uphill battle always. And I was getting really depressed and exhausted, and thought that I loved him. And I was getting to the point where I knew that I could just sink so low from the exhaustion and depression, and that this would just become my life if I didn't do something about this. And I knew that in this battle between standing up for myself and really, trying to create the life that I deserved, and the exhaustion and depression, that the latter was coming close to winning. And I also knew in my heart that the way that I was choosing to live my life was so far beneath what was actually possible and what I deserved, or what I wanted. So I came to the conclusion that it would be easier to just remain complacent and not do anything about this, but it was never going to be worth it. And so I had even at one point described I still have a letter somewhere. I wrote a letter to myself, or in a diary or something, that life had just bombed out on me, and there was no fixing it. And I don't even recognize the person that wrote that now, but it showed the struggle, the battle that was going on within me for myself. And I realized then that I had two choices. I could change this. I could change my life, and I could move forward, or I could live with regrets about what could have been. And I knew it was possible. It was just a matter of, did I want to go through the initial pain and hurt that I knew was going to come from separating with him, and then starting over again. We had all of our financial stuff was commingled. So once again, I walked away. It took several weeks for the dust to settle and die down, but this time I did something different. I took my friend's advice first of all. Even though I had been to counseling and things before, right after I had left, no one had really identified what my issue really was, and in a way, at least that I could understand. It was more superficial, 45-minute, sessions. This was a really deep, in-depth, 12-step program for codependent people, and it completely changed my life. I went through it. It took several months, and so I became aware in that program that I had to do this mental work to figure out why I was doing what I was doing, or I was just going to continue to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. Not to say that I didn't still struggle with it and I didn't still have the feelings that comes with codependency, because I did and I still do at times, but I am aware of what is going on now and have tools to manage it. So it's been a lifelong journey to learn all of those things. And then I started pairing it with what had really happened in my family history. Like I said, I'm always focused on really on future possibilities, but I like looking at the past as a case study so that we make sure that we don't repeat it. And I became dead set that I was not going to repeat the past and history and the things that had happened in my family. I did not want to do that. And to the point that I knew after, going through this initial program, that I couldn't get married and have kids until I really knew what was going on inside me, because I was terrified of passing it on to my children. And so
Now, is
several,
this, um, so is this kind of where, as you go through the rest of your journey, does your book cover a part of this story?
it does. Yes,
Okay,
it
wonderful.
does. The whole story is sprinkled in. This particular book is not in detail, but it's a combination self-help memoir. And I use my story as scenes from my story as a way to back up um, and support the points that I'm trying to make. Because
Mhm.
who am I? Nobody knows me, So, but I have this tremendous story, this real life example, this real life case study that really backs up and proves the points that I'm trying to make in the book. So I use it as validation and to give some integrity to the advice I'm trying to give people.
Did you write another book as well?
I did. So this is the first book I published, but it's the second book that I wrote. I wrote the memoir version first, which has all of the gory details in it. I will publish that in 2020.
Ah, okay, so that one's coming. Wonderful. Well, I don't want to leave the audience hanging, but I want to leave the audience hanging. I know that book is coming, but I want to really honor your journey, because I know there's more to the story, and I want people to take the time to get connected with you and your book and your story, and maybe even recognizing a little bit of themselves. Maybe not the situation, but maybe the decisions that
Yes.
they've made, right?
I talk to women quite frequently who have been keeping something, secret for many years because they don't think there's anyone else that has ever been through anything. And my story is dramatic. It doesn't have to be something like that, but
Right.
when people realize that there's someone out there to talk to. I had a woman who, after reading my book a few weeks ago, shared her story with me, and I was the first person in her life that she had ever shared it with.
Wow.
And her words were, where there's one of us, where there's two of us, there's more. And I told
Wow.
her, absolutely. There's a colony of us out there.
Right. One of the things that I really firmly believe is when you break the silence about something like this, that's when the real healing and change can begin.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So I want to thank you so much, Kim, for breaking your silence, for having the courage to share your story, not even just to endure and overcome, but to go to that next level and share what you learned, share the gory details, as you said, of the difficult things. And really, I know now you're married with children in a stable place. And so I wanted to really make sure that people understood there's a hopeful ending to this story,
There
but
it is. Yes.
but the reality is it's still a journey, right?
Right.
Right, right. So I want to make sure behind Kim on the wall there is the cover of her book. So if you're looking for Stuck a Way Out, just look for that cover. If you subscribe down below, I will have links to Kim and to Kim's book, and you can subscribe to this YouTube channel so you don't miss any of the stories. But again, I want to honor you, Kim, for sharing your journey and the courage
Thanks.
that it took.
Thanks for letting me share it.
It is my pleasure, and look forward. Stay following Kim. Follow her and find out when that memoir is coming out in 2020 because, my friends, it could change your life. You could share that book with someone else and it can change theirs. It just takes one person, right, Kim?
That's right.
Just to step in and
Right.
identify something and share something with someone who's struggling that could literally change the trajectory of their life.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing today, Kim. Don't forget to subscribe down below so that you don't miss any more of these inspiring stories. Have a wonderful day, my friends. Take care.